The enemy within. Marcus O'Reilly stood in the first row of pews in the small Baptist church on Boston's South Side that he had attended with his mother ever since he could remember. The pastor called him to the podium to open the service in prayer. He reminded everyone that there would be a potluck fellowship downstairs immediately following the service. Then, as Marcus stepped up onto the platform, his pastor put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Today we honor this very special young man. 19 years ago I had the privilege of baptizing him. I watched him grow into the fine young man who stands before you now. Tomorrow he will be leaving to start the next chapter in his life. As many of you already know, Marcus has joined the Army. Tomorrow he leaves for basic training. Please keep him and his mom and sister in your prayers." The congregation applauded. Marcus approached the podium and looked out onto the small crowd. He smiled broadly and bowed his head and said, "Let us pray." Downstairs after the service it was a festive atmosphere. People brought in dishes of food they had previously prepared and placed them on a group of tables arranged in a line in the front of the room. Everyone eventually made their way to Marcus, congratulating him and shaking his hand. They thanked him for deciding to serve his country. They wished him well and promised to pray for him. One older lady reminded him that he was an ambassador of Christ and of this church, and warned him that she expected him to act accordingly. Mr. McDougall, an older man who served as a Marine during the Vietnam War, shook his hand and pulled him into a hug. He had a serious, concerned look on his face as he looked Marcus dead in the eyes and with a sense of urgency said, "Son, my heart goes with you. Please take care of yourself." These words from this old man sent a chill up his spine. It wasn't so much what he said, but how he said it. He would come to remember that encounter many times in the next couple of years. Most of them had no way of knowing it, but this was the last time any of them would ever see this innocent young man. Well, maybe Mr. McDougall sorta knew. Yes, in fact, Marcus O'Reilly would return home in 13 months on his mid-deployment leave from Iraq, but he would not be the same young man who was with them today. The next day he stepped onto a bus for Fort Benning, Georgia, as his mom and sister looked on. As the bus drove off, they waved and his mom cried. Now Marcus had always been athletic and was in pretty good shape. He had started a regimen of diet and exercise even before he finished high school last spring to make sure that when he arrived at Benning, he would be ready to start his training. He was motivated and disciplined for a 19-year-old from Southie. He breezed through basic and the infantry training that followed. From there, he received specialized training as a medic, and almost 6 months from the day he stepped onto that bus, he was on a plane heading for a FOB on the outskirts of Baghdad. It was 2006, and Iraq had a new prime minister. Saddam Hussein was about to have his day in court, which would not go well for him. Troop deployments were escalating, and when Marcus, 3 months from his 20th birthday, stepped off that plane outside Baghdad, he was ready to do his part to win this war. They rode in trucks for about an hour to a remote FOB up north of Baghdad, arriving in their new home just after midnight. At first light, he stepped outside the trailer where he slept and was surrounded by blast walls and into the compound. Instantly, he was covered head to toe in swirling dirt. In the time it took him to walk from there to the mess hall, he was not only covered in it, but it was in his nose, his mouth, and his ears as well. On any given day, whichever way the wind happened to be blowing, he would be forced to endure one of two smells, either that of raw sewage or burning trash. After breakfast, the new troops were briefed on the area of operation and their mission there. Not what they had been told they were going to do there before they left the States, but what they would actually be doing there. The next day, he got his first glimpse of life outside the wire. The convoy of Humvees lined up in the compound and prepared to pull out. Marcus was in the right front seat of the second Humvee in line. As they exited, they drove along a dirt road around small depressions from where previous explosions had damaged the road beneath them. On one side was a canal that ran alongside the road and was filled with raw sewage. On the other side were heaping piles of trash, where he could see Iraqi children scavenging through for anything they could salvage. The driver turned to him and said, "That's their favorite place to hide IEDs, in the garbage heaps." It was only 0700, and already it was near 100 degrees. Marcus had on full body armor, a helmet, gloves, eye protection, and knee and shoulder pads as well. The dirt in his ears and nose was only a minor nuisance compared to the layers of it that were caked up in his mouth and throat. As they entered an area in downtown Baghdad that contained burnt out or bombed out buildings, the squad leader, who was sitting behind Marcus, said, "Look alive, ladies, this is where the rubber meets the road." It was, however, destined to be a quiet day in Baghdad that day. They heard a few explosions a ways off, and the radio chatter that followed. A convoy on the other end of the city had been hit with an IED, but luckily it hadn't injured anybody. They were preparing to tow the disabled Humvee back to the fob, one soldier reported. After a week or so, Marcus was getting used to the routine of going out on patrol in the morning and returning 10 hours later to the fob to eat, write a few emails home, perhaps an entry in his journal, and hit the rack fairly early. He was sleeping pretty well despite the smell and the constant swirling dirt that inhabited every opening of his body. He would shower, and by the time he walked back to his trailer, he was covered in it once again. All in all, things weren't so bad. That was about to change tomorrow. Marcus woke to rockets going off inside the wire, which wasn't unusual. The blast walls around his trailer stopped any flying debris, and just allowing more dust to creep in between the cracks from previous explosions. "They're starting early this morning," he remembered thinking to himself. Today, he was driving the third Humvee back in a line of 4. In the seat directly behind him was the company commander, a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel they referred to as the Old Man. He was career Army, a West Point graduate who thoroughly believed in the cause. He was totally convinced that we were fighting in the righteous fight and that we were there to change the lives of the Iraqi people. By this point in the war, there were many who questioned its validity. They didn't think we were making a difference. Heck, the Iraqi people themselves, whose lives we were supposedly fighting to make better, didn't even want us there. Colonel Jorge Ramirez, however, was by no means one of those cynics. When they turned the corner that put them on a main road through Baghdad, they saw a man standing in a doorway a ways off. There was no way to know that he had previously placed an IED at the base of a street lamp. The first vehicle passed, then the second. As Marcus's Humvee passed the pole, the man pressed his finger on the trigger mechanism he had in his hand. His timing was just slightly off. The majority of the projectiles hurled through right between the third and fourth Humvee. However, one plate sliced through the back of Marcus's Humvee, about 18 inches behind Colonel Ramirez's head. He heard the sound it made as it sliced through the steel plating of the Humvee. Another piece traveled on an upward angle from the blast through the engine compartment and firewall of the fourth Humvee. As it came through the firewall, it hit the driver, 19-year-old Sean Bradley from Muskegon, Michigan, right in the abdomen. From there, it continued out his back and through the seat and straight back and through the rear seat, right between the two men sitting there, and finally exiting the vehicle through the rear trunk lid. When he heard the cry for medic, Marcus ran back and helped pull Bradley from his seat. He was already dead. That was the unit's third casualty since they arrived 3 months ago, but it was Marcus's first glimpse of death. It would, however, not be his last. The soldiers would watch the news at night in the dining hall, They saw President George W. Bush tell the American people how vital the mission in Iraq was, how we were helping to liberate the Iraqi people and bring them a democracy, which would help allow them to be an independent nation that could contribute in global affairs around the world. They heard Colonel Ramirez brief his supervisors and tell the Iraqi nationals working with us how vital and necessary our mission was. He was convinced we were bringing freedom to this long oppressed people. Through all our efforts, though, the Iraqi people themselves never seemed to get it. The very people who were supposedly there to help didn't want us there. The radicals that fired on us and tried to blow us up ran in and out of the cracks of the city, making it hard to catch them. Most times, when an IED went off, we could just look around and have absolutely no idea who pressed the trigger, or from where. If we did identify and pursue a suspect, they hid in homes and were protected by the citizens who lived there. Now, there were some nationals who put their necks on the line and helped us. They served as interpreters or informers passing info to the U.S. command. They endured death threats and beatings and had family members killed or kidnapped. But they were in the vast minority of the Iraqi people. The more death Marcus O'Reilly witnessed and the more propaganda he listened to from the command staff and the president, the less he believed in the mission. Still, every day he got up and jumped in a Humvee and headed outside the wire and the safety of the blast walls. He was, after all, a soldier. His right to choose ended when he signed his entry contract into the Army. Now, when he closed his eyes to try to sleep, he saw the face and heard the screams of his friend, Corporal Steve Lansing of Bangor, Maine. Lansing's Humvee ran over a large IED planted in the loose dirt of the road that ran north to south on the outskirts of Baghdad. When his Humvee detonated the explosive, it set the vehicle straight up into the air and flipped it over. It burst into flames, and Marcus O'Reilly, who was in the Humvee directly behind it, tried to save him. All he could do was watch and listen as Lansing burned to death right in front of his eyes in the fully engulfed Humvee. Marcus would take sleeping pills prescribed to him to try to put the horror of this out of his mind long enough to steal a few hours of sleep. Sometimes it worked, most times it did not. On those nights, he would go outside and walk the perimeter inside the blast walls of the FOB. Tonight, as he walked and inhaled the air, he remembered thinking he was lucky, because tonight he smelled mostly the acrid burning smoke from the trash heaps, which he preferred to the raw sewage smell. He continued to pray every night and every morning. He would later confide in his pastor that his faith was tested here in this place where death and human suffering was a constant condition. When Marcus O'Reilly returned home for 18 days on his mid-deployment leave, his first stop was the burn center at Walter Reed Memorial Hospital in Washington, D.C. There he visited his friend and battle buddy, Lance Corporal Freddie Ortiz. Ortiz lost both his legs and was severely burned over 85% of his body. Marcus had pulled him from his burning Humvee, burning his own hands in the process. Marcus had fought frantically to save Ortiz's life. Just another picture in the slideshow of horrors that invaded Marcus's sleep. After he left there, he took the 3-hour train ride to South Boston. He was home. The first thing he did was take off his uniform and put on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt he found in his dresser. He was happy to be there with his mom and little sister, but part of him was not there. Part of him was back at the FOB. A large part, in fact. He did his best to appear to be himself, the self his family knew anyway, the self they expected and longed for. That Sunday when they attended church, there was once again a potluck in Marcus's honor. He dreaded going downstairs to the fellowship hall, but he knew he had to. It meant so much to his mom and sister, who were so proud of him. "My son the hero," his mom declared to anyone she encountered. People again came up to him, shaking his hand and trying to talk to him. "Thanks for your service," he heard that over and over. None of it seemed to make any sense to him. As he looked over the crowd, he remembered thinking, how could any of these people possibly understand? Then he saw Mr. McDougal sitting alone as he always did. When his eyes met Marcus's, Marcus remembered thinking, how could he possibly not understand? He didn't know how, but as he looked in his eyes, he knew that he did understand. Marcus made his way over and sat next to him, both men sipping on their coffee and barely saying anything to each other. It was comfortable somehow. At that moment, Marcus understood some things too. It was like a light bulb went off in his head. This solitary man, this loner, who many tried to get close to in the church family, but were unable to. He always kept himself at arm's length, never allowing anyone to get close. Marcus remembered, growing up it seemed, Mr. McDougal was always there. He came out every Wednesday and mowed the church lawn. He was there every Sunday morning and evening for service. He was always there. But nobody really knew him. Nobody knew his story, other than he was a vet from the Vietnam War. He served there with the Marines. He never talked about it, or anything really. He was just always there. But now, as Marcus looked in this man's eyes, he knew more than he cared to, more than he needed to. The two men sat there most of the afternoon in near complete silence. Complete, comfortable silence. Marcus didn't have to answer the tough questions, or any questions for that matter. He didn't have to talk about the war. No, Mr. McDougal wasn't asking any questions. Perhaps he knew the answers, or didn't want to know. The night before Marcus was scheduled to return to Iraq, he was going to take the train to New York City to join his friend and battle buddy, Vito Moreno. Vito grew up in Brooklyn and had traveled to Iraq with Marcus 13 months ago, when the two had joined the unit in Iraq. They were in infantry training together. They had the same leave schedule and were to meet up and travel back together. When Marcus was getting ready to leave, he got a call from Vito's sister, who informed Marcus that Vito was dead. Shocked, Marcus wanted answers. Vito's sister broke down and just told him that Vito had walked up onto the roof of their apartment building last night without saying a word, and just walked off the edge, falling 12 stories into the street below. Stunned, Marcus sat on his bed next to his half-packed duffel bag, holding the phone receiver in his hand. He had just seen Vito last week when the two met in the city to see a Red Sox-Yankees game. He seemed so happy, so upbeat. He was, in fact, happy and upbeat until the reality of returning to Iraq, which loomed on his horizon, drew closer. On the train to Kennedy Airport, Marcus sat quietly. On the plane, he sat next to the empty seat that belonged to his friend. He went back to Iraq, back to the fob, back to the death that constantly bit at his heels, back to the slideshow of horrors that looped endlessly through his sleepless nights. Whenever a soldier was told to do something that went against every grain of his being, his buddies would remind him, "You're a soldier, you don't have a choice. You gave up the right to choose when you signed your contract with the Army." No, he decided, we did have the right to make our own choices. We will live with the consequences, or die with them, as Vito Moreno had done. But that was his choice. He made it when he stepped off the edge of that roof. A week later, at the fob on the outskirts of Baghdad, Marcus O'Reilly made a choice as well. He walked into the command bunker, past the colonel's office, and turned right, walking into a room above the door of which hung a sign that read, "Combat Stress Counselor." Most Rangers who entered that room did so because they were ordered to. But Marcus O'Reilly made the choice to go in regardless of what anyone thought. He had had enough of this war, enough of his friends dying in his arms, enough of not being able to get the stench of burnt flesh out of his nose and throat, enough of the slideshow of horror that looped endlessly in his sleepless mind. He made a choice not to end up as another Vito Moreno or Mr. McDougal. He didn't want to be a statistic. He made the choice of life instead. He stayed until the end of his deployment and went back home for another leave. He was receiving counseling and things were getting better very slowly. He took a position in his church as the youth pastor. He met a young lady there and they married almost a year later. He stayed in the army and now worked in Southie as a recruiter. Southie was a rough neighborhood that produced the likes of Whitey Bulger and such men. Many young people there had no hope for the future. The ones that couldn't escape to college somewhere or get out of the area became criminals and gang members. Marcus made it his mission to help those people. He offered many of them an alternative to that life, a career in the army, which was a life-saving blessing to many he enlisted. One day, a young man in a Letterman jacket, obviously from an affluent upbringing, walked into the office with his girl on his arm. He approached Marcus and told him he wanted to join. He said he wanted to go and liberate the Iraqi people, and he wasn't afraid to kill or die if necessary to achieve that objective. He was gung-ho. Maybe just a little too gung-ho. Marcus sat with him for over an hour, carefully steering him and guiding him away from a career in the army. When he got up and left, the recruiter, a good friend of Marcus's who sat across the aisle from him, said to him, "Dude, what happened? How did you lose him? He was ready to sign on the dotted line when he walked in." Marcus looked at him and replied, "Sometimes you have to pull him out of the Humvee before it catches on fire." He smiled slightly, pleased with his actions. His friend, who was 10 years older but who had never seen combat, just shook his head and said, "Whatever, dude." The young man that walked out would be part of a new slideshow in Marcus's head, one he could recall on command when he needed to. A slideshow of life, not death. The end.